Welcome to Gospel Lessons. I'm Kevin Prince.
Today we're talking about the role prophetic fallibility played in the decision to restrict blacks from the priesthood in early church history.
My guest today is church history expert Scott Woodward. Scott has been a professional Latter-day Saint educator in the church education system for 20 years, including in seminary and institutes, in the religion department at BYU, and currently as a member of the religion faculty at BYU Idaho. He is a regular speaker at Education Week and other conferences, and is also a co-host of the Church History Matters podcast, which addresses complex issues in our church's history. This series is sponsored by Go and Do Travel, which provides LDS-based cruises offering an opportunity to connect with like-minded members and learn from experts and influencers. I'll be joining the Momentum 2026 cruise, and if you're interested, use promo code PRINCE to get $100 off. All proceeds from Gospel Lessons, including sponsorships, go to charity. Most people I talk to, and my own personal opinion, is that blacks in the priesthood with Brigham Young is a mistake. That would be an example, in my opinion, of a prophet making a mistake that has led to a lot of issues and pain around. I don't know how you feel. We've never had this conversation before, so I don't know how you feel on this subject, but tell me about what you think about that.
Yeah, the race and the priesthood and the temple ban, I think, is the very best case study of prophetic fallibility on full display. Yes. It's low-hanging fruit. It really helps us see the extent to which church leaders can make mistakes and how those mistakes can be perpetuated and how real people can be hurt by those mistakes. Yeah, 100%. And let's talk about this for a few minutes, because I think the church has done some great work recently on this. I think the Gospel Topics essay on race in the priesthood is really helpful. So it's helpful on the one hand, but when we think through the implications, we are going to hit really hard. We're going to smack into prophetic fallibility. Okay, so for instance, let me frame it like this. Here's this quote from the Gospel Topics essay that's so good. It says, "Today, the church disavows, okay, we want nothing to do with, the theories advanced in the past that black skin is a sign of disfavor or a curse." Let's pause right there. Do you know how many church leaders taught that, Kevin? That black skin is a sign of a curse?
I'm doing math in my head, and the numbers are going up.
It's a lot. It's a lot. Yeah, that's not even the end of the sentence. Comma, or that black skin reflects unrighteous actions in a premortal life. Do you know how many church leaders taught that?
Yeah, a lot.
People who were apostles, people who were in the first presidency, people who were the president of the church. And now it's a semicolon in the quote. That mixed race marriages are a sin. Do you know how many taught that? Semicolon. Or that blacks or people of any other race or ethnicity are inferior in any way to anyone else. Close quote. Do you know how many people taught that? So here's a statement by President Oakes talking about this. He said, "Some people put reasons to the priesthood ban, and they turned out to be spectacularly wrong." Spectacularly wrong. And then he says, "There's a lesson in that." Well, that's a cool statement on its own, but when you start thinking about some of the people who were spectacularly wrong, here's a list. This is not exhaustive, but Brigham Young was spectacularly wrong. He taught that blacks were the descendants of Cain, and they were marked with black skin. They were descendants of Ham, and therefore they could not hold priesthood. Therefore, they could not govern in the church. And he said some very, very racist things. He talked about interracial marriage as being like worthy of death. Anyway, so you got Brigham Young. John Taylor, definitely. He leans into the doctrine of Ham doctrine. Wilford Woodruff, Orson Hyde, Parley P. Pratt, Orson Pratt, George F. Richards, Joseph F. Smith, B.H. Roberts, Joseph Fielding Smith, a couple exclamation points, maybe after his name, Bruce R. McConkie, Mark E. Peterson, Alvin R. Dyer, Milton R. Hunter, J. Reuben Clark Jr., the entire first presidency in 1949, a letter they wrote, Harold B. Lee, and on. This is a list of people who were spectacularly wrong, to use Elder Oaks' phrase.
not just wrong. I mean, they certainly were wrong, but these weren't just leaders of the church. Many that you just listed were historians for the church, wrote the history of the church.
Yeah.
And as you well know as a scholar, whoever's writing the history can kind of have some literary power there to shape the hearts and minds of how things were and how things will be. Am I right?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, George Buchanan was a really early influence on the narrative of the priesthood ban. Yeah, Joseph Fielding Smith, like I said, he wrote the book A Way to Perfection, or The Way to Perfection, where he lays out an entire rationale for the priesthood ban that kind of becomes the go-to for the church for the next multiple decades. And he was a church historian as well, B.H. Roberts. Yeah, you're right. But I want to just add a layer here of context that I think is helpful. Again, this is a great example of one where you're like, yeah, no matter how you contextualize this, it doesn't feel good. And I would agree with that. There's no free pass here. In the church's own statement, we disavow these theories. We disavow them. They're not right. We don't endorse them. We want nothing to do with them. So that's the current church stance on the statements made by that list of people. And I think that's the right way to begin on this topic is, okay, where are we standing now? Are we in the right place now? Does this feel right? Does this feel consistent with the teachings of Jesus? Yes. Does this feel consistent with the revelations that Joseph Smith received? Yes. Okay. Does this feel right as like a human, like the Spirit of God in my soul? Does this feel right to not, favor one race over another because of superficial characteristics like skin? Yes, definitely. That feels good. That feels right. Okay. So we're in a good place now, right? Yes. Okay, so what do I do with the last, all that history though, from Brigham Young to Spencer W. Kimball, at least, right? 120 something years. Well, that's going to challenge your assumptions about prophets, especially if you have a strong assumption about prophetic infallibility. This is going to shatter that. And then you're going to have to decide what to do with that. And it's pretty painful. So like I said, I highly suggest we get rid of that assumption in our soul first. And then let's go look at some of the context here. So, for instance, contextually, the truth is that all of these apostles were spectacularly wrong right alongside most of white America in their day. But what's clear from a close look is that the church tracked pretty closely with American white culture during most of its history, especially this troubling history. When attitudes, let me say it like this. When white attitudes about black inferiority were customary in America, guess what? They were customary in the church. When white Protestant Americans were twisting biblical verses about Cain and Ham to justify slavery in pre-Civil War America, or to justify segregation in post-Civil War America, guess what? You find Latter-day Saint leaders doing the same, using the same verses. Of course, LDS leaders were able to add another layer of theological damage by innovating premortal, less valiancy justifications as well. But we draw from the Cain stuff, the Ham stuff, and then we add on a layer of premortal, less valiancy. Let me give you some really specific examples. So there's this historian named Edward Long who wrote an influential book published back in 1774 that promoted black inferiority and it defended slavery. In that book, he stated that mulattoes, right, mixed race, black-white offspring, are, quote, of the mule kind. Mulatto comes from, by the way, horrible word, but they're of the mule kind and they're not capable of producing, meaning like mulattoes can't have children, he taught. Well, that's obviously a ridiculous idea biologically. You can disprove that all day long, but that idea started to spread in the United States. And in 1847, we have Brigham Young on record saying, quote, mulattoes are like mules. They can't have children, close quote. So here's a clear example that Brigham Young is drawing on Edward Long's ideas that have now permeated the culture, right? Another example, in an effort to promote segregation during Reconstruction after the Civil War, Several states of our union adopted variations of what's called the one-drop rule, which made anyone with any Negro blood, they said, inferior to white people. They would not have the same privileges as white people. They would need to be segregated into the black rather than the white privileged areas. And it's actually against that very national backdrop happening at that very moment that the first presidency introduces in 1907 its own one-drop policy regarding priesthood and temple privileges. I'll read it right here. Here you go. Quote, the descendants of Ham, that's how they referred to blacks, again, the Protestant idea that made it into the church. The descendants of Ham may receive baptism and confirmation, but no one known to have in his veins Negro blood, matters not how remote a degree, can either have the priesthood in any degree or the blessings of the temple of God, no matter how otherwise worthy he may be. So that's the 1907 policy. That's actually the moment where that becomes a policy in our church. It was kind of practice from Brigham Young's time, 1852 on, but this becomes official in 1907, right? Solidifying that into policy. So that's a really clear, concrete example. Like that language, one drop policy or remote degree of Negro blood is being used in the United States broadly. What happens in the church? Our church leaders use that as justifications for segregation in our own church. Another one in the 1940s when Disney was depicting black characters like Little Black Sambo and Rastus and Uncle Remus, depicting them as like happy little slaves. The church's most prominent magazine, The Improvement Era, published stories and ran ads about these same Disney characters. Just kind of leaned right into that. Again, the point is, I don't want to belabor it, but Latter-day Saint attitudes about and treatment of blacks has tightly tracked those of broader white American culture in which it was embedded. Why? I think it's church leaders are the product of the environment, and so they typically share similar attitudes and beliefs. And this is going to be one of the reasons it's going to take so long to overturn the priesthood and temple ban. So we could not get enough church leaders united around the idea to ask God to lift the ban if that was appropriate. And the first time we did have that with President Kimball, where he got consensus in the quorum to ask the Lord if they could remove the ban. The very first time they asked, Kevin, the ban was lifted. God sent an overwhelming Pentecostal, rushing a mighty wind type of answer to the Quorum of the 12. If you read their words about it, where their hearts burned with the righteousness of this decision, as President Benson once said. Like they just felt deeply, like profoundly, that it was time. Because the Lord says, good, now you're united to ask me. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And my goodness, you guys are slow.
It took a while. It took 100+ years, but finally there was a quorum, First Presidency and 12, who were united in asking that question. Prior to that, there was not. The quorum was not united. There were not enough who wanted to lift the ban. When segregation was lifted, I think it was in the 1950s, maybe 1954, there were church leaders that continued to try to promote segregation in the church, like Elder Marky Peterson. Some embarrassing talks he gave where he kind of leaned into it and said, no, we need to keep it separated, because here's the big fear. If we don't segregate, then intermarriage is inevitable. Intermarriage is inevitable. And the worst possible thing that could happen in the fears of white America was interracial marriage. This would be the end of us, right? This would be the end of civilization. There's all kinds of fear mongering about racial intermarriage. And so that's deeply embedded in the church. We see statements from Brigham Young all the way to, President Kimball talking about and counseling against racial intermarriage. In fact, Joseph Smith actually counseled against racial intermarriage, actually. So, yeah, this was deeply embedded in the United States, and we see this just tracking with church leaders. So, and it's infinitely more difficult the more you believe in prophetic infallibility. And yeah, I don't know how else to say it than that. Like it stings more, and it can come to a breaking point for some people because they have embedded in their hearts and minds somewhere this assumption that God would not call people with that kind of, belief systems about blacks, or he would not let this perpetuate. We have assumptions about God. He would not let this perpetuate from generation to generation if it was so wrong, or if the church was quote unquote true. God would have intervened somehow, right? We have assumptions about God that need to be examined as well. Like, why would he allow this to happen? Well, that's worth it. That's worth examining. But yeah, I think that the historical record's pretty clear that there were these false doctrines that were introduced: curse of Ham, curse of Cain, premortal less valiance. And then couple that with false memories. It started to be told by Abraham O. Smoot, thinking of Zebedee Coltrane, George Q. Cannon. They start to say that Joseph Smith was the originator of this ban, which is not true. We can prove that historically. He did not. But that becomes the memory, the false memory. So false doctrines, false memories. And then there was this unwillingness, because I think of the culture of the day, and an unperceived need even among a lot of church leaders to really question the precedent of their predecessors. And so over time, this becomes this entrenched policy in the church, supported by these false doctrines and false memories, that now no one even sees a need to question. And it was the disruption, I think, in our own country, in the United States, the disruption with the civil rights movements, with the ending of segregation and all that, that starts to jostle some people to kind of rethink their assumptions about blacks and whites and intermarriage and all of this. It's happening nationwide. And as it's happening nationwide, guess what? It's happening in the church. And so now we're starting to ask the right questions. And as we start asking those kinds of questions, it leads the prophets slowly, maybe slower than some would have liked, but it leads them eventually to the 1978 revelation. And so, I mean, that's the reality of the situation, isn't it? This is how God actually allows prophets to be, how he allows prophets to act. He actually allows them to have false assumptions. He allows them to act on those false assumptions. And when they're finally united, to ask him whether or not that's correct, he is willing to weigh in on it, but only when they're unitedly willing to ask him in humility.
So it's like at some point we all have to say, like you did earlier, what is the now? The now is, this is the church's statement on it. The now is, here's how I feel about it. The now is, and when you get there, we can stop thinking about and worrying about so much the infallibility of these prophets, understanding a lot of it is cultural and historical and kind of the way it is, unfortunate. And yet the beautiful thing is we've moved past it.
Yeah, we're at a better place now than we have ever been. I mean, here's a statement from President Nelson, this from 2020. He said, "God does not love one race more than another." Bam.
Oh.
Here's another one. "I assure you that your standing before God is not determined by the color of your skin." He says, "Today I call upon our members everywhere to lead out in abandoning attitudes and actions of prejudice and plead with you to promote respect for all of God's children," close quote. It's like, yes. Where are we now? We're in a great place now. Are we learning from our history? I think so. Mm-hmm. Are we better than we've ever been? Yeah, I mean, no question. On this topic, for instance, this great statement from Elder Bruce R. McConkie, who had said some pretty racist stuff. Man, he had continued to promote a lot of those falsehoods that the church currently disavows. And only like 2 months after the 1978 revelation, he gave a talk called "All Are Alike Unto God." And in that talk, listen to this. He said, "Forget everything that I have said, or what President Brigham Young or President George Q. Cannon or whomsoever has said in days past that is contrary to the present revelation." Speaking of that 1978 revelation, granting full privileges, priesthood and temple to blacks. He said, quote, "We spoke with a limited understanding and without the light and knowledge that now has come into the world," close quote.
look at how these men, well, Bruce R. McConkie in this particular example, had learned and progressed himself. These are men that are on their same journey with us in their progression in this mortal life, and they're learning and progressing line upon line, precept upon precept, just like you and I are. And none of us are guilt-free in everything. So let's cut them some slack and let them learn and grow and progress and help teach us too. I don't see these prophets and apostles at the end of the race telling me how to race. I see them as significantly further down the path telling me how to navigate where I'm going, as opposed to being at the end. And I think that's okay.
Again, Doctrine and Covenants 1, right? I call upon weak and simple people, those who commit errors, those who lack wisdom, and those who sin. I work explicitly with those kind of people because that's the only kind available to me, and I'm happy to do it. I'm happy to do it. I don't feel like the Lord is wringing his hands over that. He's just stating the fact. So there's so much to talk about with this. I come back to what I said earlier, that we've got to hold both of these truths together in tension at the same time. Prophets are fallible, and God will work through them in spite of their flaws to bring about his marvelous work as they humble themselves before him, D&C 1 says, as they seek wisdom from him, as they seek to repent of their sins. There's all these conditions. I will work with you. I recognize your flaws. I'm not bothered by that. As long as you are seeking me, trying to get better and improve, I will continue to work with you.
Well, Scott, I really appreciate you coming on. As I hope people can get a sense of just the value you bring, and imagine getting this for an hour, however long it's going to be each week, as you guys do church history for this next year, 2025. I'm super excited for that. So thanks for coming on here and sharing your understanding with everybody.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you, Kevin, for having me.
All right, we'll see you.
Okay, take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks for joining us today and learning about false traditions. Remember to subscribe so future episodes are easier to find. Thanks for watching.